Clerk, please. Order, please. Daily routine. Presenting and reading petitions. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise today to table a petition, the operative clause being the following users and residents of 256 Highway are asking the government to provide additional funding to complete the approved capital project on Route 256 so that the entire length of the road be completed in the 2013 construction season. And I have affixed my name to that petition.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I read this resolution on behalf of the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas National Medical Laboratory Week will be celebrated April the 22nd to the 26th, and whereas medical laboratory technology is the fastest growing health and care profession in Canada, and whereas medical laboratory technologists conduct laboratory tests with physicians and clinicians depending on accuracy, diagnose and treat illness and to monitor patients' health, and whereas medical laboratory staff consist of medical laboratory technologists, medical laboratory assistants, and medical clerical staff who work as a team to provide information about health in a timely manner. Therefore, it resolved that all members of the House recognize the efforts of the professionalism of the medical laboratory technologists, assistants, support staff, and who strive to help maintain the health and well-being of Nova Scotians and all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 33 of the Acts of 2004, the Protection for Persons in Care Act.
The Honourable Minister for Community Services begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 33 of the Acts of 2004, the Protection for Persons in Care Act.
Bill number 62, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 33 of the Acts of 2004, the Protection for Persons in Care Act.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 160 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Maintenance and Custody Act.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 160 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Maintenance and Custody Act.
Bill number 63, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 160 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Maintenance and Custody Act.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2012, the Maritime Link Act, to permit the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board to extend time.
That is.
Yes, it is.
Very good. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2012, the Maritime Link Act, to permit the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board to extend time.
Bill number 64, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2012, the Maritime Link Act, to permit the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board to extend time.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2012, the Maritime Link Act.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2012, the Maritime Link Act.
Bill number 65, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 9 of the Acts of 2012, the Maritime Link Act.
Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw the attention of the members of the House to the East Gallery, where members will see Mr. Arno Leewalt, who is a longtime constituent of mine, a very fine gentleman, also happens to be the father of one of our pages, Keith Leewalt. Arno is immensely proud of Keith, as he should be. Keith was the top student in his year at Halifax West High School. I heard, but that's in the past, and I heard this morning that Keith may be the top student in his year at Dalhousie Law School. I'd like to ask all members to find lots for Keith to do this morning so his father can see him in action. And I'd like all members to give Mr. Arno Leewalt a warm welcome to the House today.
We welcome all guests to the gallery this morning and hope that they enjoy this morning's proceedings. Notices of motion. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bedford Volunteer Recognition Reception annually recognizes the extensive efforts of the many volunteers who make Bedford a wonderful place in which to live, and whereas Carolyn Kroll is a compassionate social justice advocate who works tirelessly at Bedford United Church to advance progressive causes, and whereas Carolyn has held many leadership positions throughout the church, including chairperson of the pastoral care team for 11 years, chair of the inclusivity team, co-leader of the adult study group, co-coordinator of the church elders, of which she's one, and she advocated for Bedford United Church to become an affirming congregation, and also has volunteered with the Fort Sackville Foundation for many years as their secretary. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Carolyn Kroll on her many years of service to Bedford United Church and Fort Sackville Foundation, and thank her for making Bedford a more compassionate, progressive community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate. And Keith,
there has been a request for waivers. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Sunday, Nova Scotia will join in the Day of Mourning to remember those who died, were injured, or became ill at work. And whereas in 2012, more than 26,000 Nova Scotians were injured at work, and tragically, 32 Nova Scotians died. And whereas the Day of Mourning is an opportunity for employees and employers to honor the lives lost on the job and to renew their commitment to improve health and safety in the workplace. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House mark the Day of Mourning by remembering those who have died and encourage all Nova Scotian employers and workers to use safe practices in the workplace. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waivers and agreed. All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Bedford Volunteer Recognition Reception annually recognizes the extensive efforts of the many volunteers who make Bedford a wonderful place in which to live. And whereas Edmund Conway has been a devoted Bedford volunteer firefighter for 43 years and is described as the kind of man you can always count on, whether it's something that needs to be cleaned or repaired, or a sick fireman visited, or any job that needs being done. And whereas Edmund has also volunteered with many other organizations, the Bedford Days Parade, the Christmas Santa Parade, the Prostate Cancer and Muscular Dystrophy Associations, Bedford Baptist Church, and the Sackville Winter Carnival. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House of Assembly thank Edmund Conway for helping to keep Bedford safe and for contributing so mightily to the life of our community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Cape Breton Golden K and Eastlink TV have recognized the importance of North Sydney Youth Inclusion Program, a significant donation of $10,000. And whereas the program works with troubled kids, helping them with schoolwork, behavior issues, community consciousness, in addition to getting the kids involved in physical activities, sporting events, and emotional support. And whereas these kids are the kids that need help, and a 67% drop in the crime rate for this age group is proof that the help is working and needs to continue. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank the organizers of this program and the many people and organizations that support it and the young lives it will change. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, par la présente, j'avise que je proposerai une date ultérieure l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que la Caisse populaire de Clare joue un rôle de premier plan dans le relais pour la vie, une activité de prélèvement de fonds pour lutter contre la maladie du cancer, et attendu que le gouvernement canadien reconnaît des regroupements de bénévoles qui contribuent de façon exceptionnelle au bien-être des familles et des communautés, attendu que la Caisse populaire de Clare a mérité une reconnaissance spéciale pour son bénévolat pour la région atlantique du Canada, qu'il soit résolu que cette Assemblée félicite la Caisse populaire pour avoir reçu cette marque de distinction du gouvernement canadien pour la région atlantique. Monsieur le Président, je propose l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas la Caisse populaire de Clare plays a key role in the annual Relay for Life in Clare, and whereas the Canadian government gives awards to businesses that are making exceptional contributions to the well-being of families and communities across our country, and whereas la Caisse populaire de Clare was recognized as a business leader in the Atlantic region for its exceptional contribution for its volunteer work, therefore, be resolved that this Assembly congratulates la Caisse populaire de Clare for winning this award for the Atlantic region. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Clare. Argyle, sorry.
Monsieur le Président, une date ultérieure, je demanderai l'adoption de la résolution suivante. Attendu que chaque année, au mois de septembre, le Resource Recovery Fund Board lance un concours pour les écoles des grades PA12. Attendu que ce programme encourage les élèves à jouer un rôle actif dans leur communauté, à promouvoir la réduction des déchets par le recyclage et le compostage. Attendu que P1 gagnant était professeur Daniel Thibault de l'École Pamlico Ouest, grade 2 à 3 finaliste était Autumn Atkinson de l'École Plymouth, et gagnant de grade 7 à 9 était Marc Leblanc de l'école secondaire de Parent-Bas. Par conséquent, qu'il soit résolu que tous les membres de cette Assemblée félicitent Daniel Thibault, Autumn Atkinson et Marc Leblanc pour leur participation dans ce programme et les remercier de leur rôle en aidant à faire la Nouvelle-Écosse un leader dans la réduction des déchets. Monsieur le Président, je demande l'adoption de cette résolution sans préavis et sans débat. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future date. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution, whereas Every year in the month of September, the Resource Recovery Fund Board launches a contest for P-12 schools. And whereas this program encourages students to take an active role in their communities by promoting waste reduction by recycling and composting. And whereas the primary to one winner was teacher Danielle Thibault of École Pubnico West, grade 2-3 runner-up was Autumn Atkinson from Plymouth School, and the grade 7-3 winner was Marc Leblanc from École Secondaire de Paramba. Therefore, be resolved, members of this House of Assembly congratulate Danielle Thibault, Autumn Atkinson, and Marc Leblanc for their participation in this program and thank them for their role in helping make Nova Scotia a leader in waste reduction. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 95 years ago today marks the passage of the Nova Scotia Franchise Act, which gave women the right to vote for the first time. And whereas the passage of that legislation came as the result of the courageous advocacy of Edith Archibald and an understanding that the right to vote is a fundamental element of our democracy. Whereas Nova Scotia was the first province in Atlantic Canada to accept that a fully enfranchised population of men and women is a necessity so that our democracy functions properly. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize this anniversary as an important milestone in Nova Scotia's history, and that men and women continue to fully participate in our democracy, not only as voters, but also as candidates and citizens. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas each year Halifax Regional Municipality recognizes extraordinary contributions of individuals and groups who volunteer their time to make our communities better. And whereas for 5 years, Alex Davis has been a patient and family advisor volunteering on multiple councils, including the IWK Youth Advisory Council, IWK Family Leadership Council, IWK Emergency Department Family Advisory Council, along with speaking at several conferences, helping to empower youth to share their stories in the healthcare system and educate staff on how to work with youth, parents, and families. And whereas on April 17, 2013, Alex did receive an HRM Volunteer Award for all his efforts to make a difference in his community and province. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the Legislature congratulate Alex Davis on receiving this award and thank him for his timeless efforts in making health care more youth-friendly. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Christmas season doesn't really get rolling on the north side until the annual North City Firemen's Christmas Parade takes place. And whereas thousands of residents turn out to watch the lighted floats wind their way through the streets of North Sydney, and whereas Chief Lloyd McIntosh and his department are responsible for a multitude of smiling children and adults being filled with Christmas cheer. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank Chief McIntosh and the North Sydney Fire Department for their Christmas gift to the North Side. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers truly are the heart of our community and give freely of their time to help organizations throughout our community, and whereas on May 8, 2013, the Halifax Mainland North Volunteer Recognition Committee will be holding their milestone 10th Annual Community Champion Awards dinner to recognize outstanding volunteers who consistently dedicate their time and talents to improving the lives of others. And whereas Stuart Whalen of Clayton Park West has been nominated for this award by Prostate Cancer Canada, in recognition of his commitment to help raise funds through events such as the Stick It to Prostate Cancer Ball Hockey Tournament and the annual Father's Day Walk Run, as well as his volunteer work for the VON, Camp Hill Veterans Hospital, and Abbey Lane. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate Stuart Whalen on receiving a 2013 Community Champion Award, thank him for his dedication to helping others in his community and province, and wish him every success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyll.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas tomorrow is Daffodil Day, a special day which is part of the Canadian Cancer Society's annual Daffodil Month. And whereas on this special day we show our support for those living with cancer and remember those we have lost. And whereas the Cancer Society urges people across the country to renew their commitment to fight back against cancer and someday find a cure for this disease. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge tomorrow is Daffodil Day and show our support for those living with cancer and raise awareness about prevention and good health. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, government business. I will now recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please call public bills for second reading.
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, please call Bill number 61, Cyber Safety Act.
Bill number 61, Cyber Safety Act. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister for the status of Advisory Council for the Status of Women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if I might be permitted a brief introduction before.
Oh, certainly.
Thank you very much. In the East Gallery today, we have Stephanie McGuinness-Langley, who's the Executive Director, the Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and Jeannie Flynn, who works at the Council office as well. And I would just ask them to stand and receive the appreciation of the House for all their work on these issues.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this morning's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're all aware that a very tragic incident in our province has touched a chord with every Nova Scotian. And over the last number of years, a number of these incidents have happened, and there's always been a certain level of response and trying to improve the situation. But this last one, I would have to say, created anger and frustration and a general collective will that we need to be a better province in terms of how we look after one another. And Nova Scotians want us to work together to prevent situations like this from happening in the future. And I know that every member of this House shares that view. We may be politicians, we may be leaders in our communities, but we're parents and grandparents first. And we can just imagine some of the pain and suffering that families go through when a child is bullied or cyberbullied or loses their life in this province. And certainly I want to start off by expressing the sympathy of all members of this House to the Parsons family for the very unfortunate death of their daughter, Rehtaeh. So the province is not going to defend, we will not defend the status quo, because we, like every other level of government, like every other organization, every individual in this province, we're committed to making the changes that are needed. And we understand that there's a leadership role that government needs to provide. And we are going to work to ensure that Nova Scotians who need help know where to get it. and that over the years we improve the level of supports that we have for families in crisis in this province. I want to pay credit to Professor Wayne McKay, who was the chair of the Task Force on Bullying and Cyberbullying, the members of the task force, and the tremendous group of people who worked behind the scenes to provide a lot of the research information to set up the meetings and to help prepare the report. That report is foundational, both in terms of what we're doing here in the province of Nova Scotia, but has a lot of good information, I know, that will be shared and has been shared across jurisdictions of Canada. Yesterday, I introduced an act to address and prevent cyberbullying, and it will help prevent cyberbullying and give out a clear message to all Nova Scotians that online cyberbullying will not be tolerated, and that people who perform that function will have to be accountable for their actions online. So the legislation will allow victims and families to seek a court order protection. The court will order someone to stop talking to or about another person online. And it leads up to protection orders where a judge could actually order that the computer, the smartphone, the tablet could actually be confiscated if there's not cooperation and if the earlier interventions are not heeded to. We also introduced, through making cyberbullying a tort, the ability for victims to be able to sue for damages. And it was a clear message to parents that they are accountable for the online behavior of their young people. So if there was an underage bully and it was taken to that point in terms of the intervention and taken to court in a civil case, the parents would then be held liable for the actions unless they could prove that they had performed reasonable supervision of their children online. So probably the part of the legislation that attracted a lot of attention from people because it's unique in Canada is setting up a new cyber scan unit by the fall of this year. Probably take 4 to 6 months to put it into operation, and certainly everyone's committed to have it up and operating as quickly as possible. So there will be a director and 5 investigators. They will take complaints from anyone in the province, can be students, family, parents, adults. This investigative unit will actually work on cyberbullying against a person of any age, not just young people in the province. But it will help victims and families, and it also will have the ability to file protection orders. And if after investigation it goes to the higher end of maliciousness and lack of cooperation, the unit will be then in a position to hand the case over to the police. The legislation also amended the Education Act, and the amendments clarified that principals and school boards will cooperate with the province and its agencies on these issues. And it also clarified that principals do have the ability to look into incidents that happen out of school hours and off the school grounds when it affects the learning culture, the learning environment of students in their school. And that was clarification that the principals and school boards were looking for. So, Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 61 be now read a second time.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today and speak to Bill number 61, an act to address and prevent cyberbullying. And I will repeat in my opening comments the commitment that was made in response to the ministerial statement, the commitment that was made by the Leader of the Official Opposition and by the entire Liberal caucus to support and work with the Minister as she has assumed a huge responsibility. The Minister has taken a file from education, she's taken a file from justice, and she's been given the responsibility to oversee the workings of both of those. And I do sincerely, I've done it privately, but I want to do it publicly, thank the Minister for assuming that responsibility and again reiterate our commitment to work with her on that project or on that assignment. I would also like to say to all members of the House and to all of Nova Scotians that it is truly tragic and unfortunate that these kinds of bills have to come forward as a result of someone else's tragedy and at somebody else's expense. And I guess it's an indication that perhaps we are more reactive than proactive, but we all do extend our sympathies to all families, not just one family, but to all families who have experienced a tragedy as a result of bullying or cyberbullying. We recognize that there are many things that come into play, and bringing education and justice together to look at a solution is trying to cover all of those aspects that do impact on our young people's lives. Those of us who have been involved in working with young people all of our careers, in whatever profession we have chosen, recognize that the introduction of social media and the lack of controls in social media have translated obviously into easy, quick communication, but they've also provided a wonderful opportunity for those who wish to be malicious and cruel and evil. And they are able to do that with the protection of their own privacy, but not protecting and respecting the privacy of others. And we seem to have a generation, Mr. Speaker, who have some difficulty determining what is personal and what is private, and fail to understand that once something is posted or once something is written, that it may be personal, but once it's typed and once you press send, it's not personal anymore. It becomes very public. And then our young people get caught in this web which they can't escape because they are not prepared for what will come back at them or how far those images or those comments will travel. And so unknowingly, in many cases, our young kids do post things. And there are predators out there, and they're not all young people, but there are predators out there who look for opportunities and get some thrill, I guess, about doing and harming others. And so it is important that the education component and the justice component come together here. As I said yesterday at the announcement when the at Halifax West, that there appear to be a lot of things in this bill that can address some of the issues that we have. But what I added to that was the real proof of this and the real effectiveness of this will be when those words are put into action. And it is unfortunate that we have had opportunities in this legislature to put words into action on this particular topic on several occasions. And I know the minister has referred to the McKay Task Force. And we have mentioned that many times. And I think the language that's now being used is that it is a foundation document. Well, Mr. Speaker, there were a number of, a lot of information in that document, but there were some 85 recommendations. And some of those recommendations were recommendations that could translate immediately into action. Wouldn't cost any government any money. And there were some that were long-term, because we do have to address the culture of cyberbullying. We do have to look at where we are in our society with respect for ourselves and for others. But there were some recommendations that could easily have translated into action over a year ago, 14, 15 months ago. And that's the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, that we in this legislature missed. And that's where we in this legislature failed young girls and families because we didn't step up to the plate and take a recommendation and put it into action. For example, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken about this before, but there were 2 bills that were introduced in response to the task force recommendations. And those bills, we have heard from the people who have been asked to implement some of those things that they didn't feel that it was making any difference in the job that they were asked to do. And these people were in particular people in our public schools. We also know from those recommendations that when the bills that were introduced by the Minister of Education came before law amendments, some of those recommendations that could have translated into some immediate action were not in the bill. And the opportunity for both opposition parties was to submit amendments to the Law Amendments Committee, which did address some of the serious omissions in those bills. And both parties went before the Law Amendments Committee and presented those. Also at the Law Amendments Committee, members will recall that we had some members who had been on the task force, and we had people from the community who had experienced a tragedy in their family because of bullying and cyberbullying. And I fail to understand, Mr. Speaker, how members in this legislature who say they care about kids and who say they want to do the best they can could have said no. Those who presented at law amendments could not understand, and they expressed it. In fact, one of those members who presented, one of the mothers who presented, has said most recently, "I feel like I've been slapped in the face." And if we, as members of this legislature, cannot look those people in the eye and say that we have done and that we are doing everything we can possibly do to protect our young people, then we should be ashamed. When we have people in our communities, who come before us and they're not asking us for money. They're not asking us to implement something that is going to cost and become a budget line for someone. They are simply asking for a member of this legislature to begin to speak to their counterparts in Ottawa about changes to the criminal code, which is exactly what recommendation 44 from Wayne McKay's report said, would not cost a cent, but the Law Amendments Committee, which we know is dominated by NDP members, refused to accept that amendment. And all it would have taken 14 or 15 months ago is to do what has now been done because of severe public pressure and because, to use the Premier's words, this has garnered international attention. Well, I'm sorry, if we have to wait until something garners international attention before we step up to the plate and do something to protect our kids, those discussions in Ottawa could have started 15 months ago, Mr. Speaker.
Please, order. Order. The honourable member for Colchester North has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We had an opportunity 15 months ago for the Minister of Justice to fly up to Ottawa and start those conversations. But 15 months have passed and nothing happened. Now, because we are garnering international attention, we're taking some steps. And as
You do realize that, right?
Mr. Speaker, some of the people who have so much to say have never been in a position to do anything. And Mr. Speaker, when you are in that position, you do the best you can. And when you get a recommendation from your own task force which says, contact the people in Ottawa and start talking, that doesn't take much money, it doesn't take any money, but it does take somebody who cares. It does take somebody who cares, and I believe that all members in this legislature care. And if they could put partisan politics aside, sometimes there would be some action. We also know, Mr. Speaker, that on the task force, there were members who had expertise in their own field. And one of the recommendations that came out of that task force was to have the ability for service providers to discontinue the cell phone account if it had been found that there had been inappropriate use of that account. The people who were on the task force from the communications side and from service providers knew that that could happen. And it came as a recommendation. It came as recommendation 42, I believe. And again, that would not have cost 1 red cent. But there could have been something in the bills that were introduced in April and I think again in October and in the amendments that came after both of those bills that spoke to that. But those bills were silent on that. And now, 14, 15 months later, we see that being addressed. And we welcome that. Our issue is, Mr. Speaker, why did we allow that time to pass? Why did we allow our young people to be caught up in this social net for the last 14, 15 months and have no place where they could reach out? I know that the minister has extended an invitation for leaders of the other parties to meet with her, and I know that our leader has done that, and I encourage that, and I thank the minister for providing that opportunity, because it is an issue for all of us. And if the voices of the opposition can be heard through their leaders to the minister, then I believe that that can strengthen the legislation. And I am pleased to know that at least one of those meetings has been held. You know, Mr. Speaker, we have challenges in our schools. We have a lot of the problems of society playing themselves out in our schools, and teachers are challenged with how they can best respond to that. You know, years ago, when I was in the classroom, I used to say, if you could teach for 5 hours, and I've heard other educators say this, if you could go in, teach for 5 hours, what a great day it would be and how much kids would learn. But teachers are tasked with doing a lot of other issues, dealing with a lot of other issues, and trying to get their class and their students in a state of readiness before they can start to teach. And in the last couple of years, that state of readiness has been much more difficult to achieve because they are dealing with things that have happened outside the school. Yet the school is the place where they come together, and the school is the place where we are trying to respond to those concerns that they have. We have to remember, Mr. Speaker, that students are in the classroom 5 or 6 hours a day. But the other 18 or 19 hours, teachers have no control over what they're doing. Principals have no control over what they're doing. Parents and the community play a huge part in bringing about the cultural change that we need so that our young people can be safe. If there is a role for teachers and for principals, then we take that seriously. And trying to deal with what happens in those other 19 hours when kids come into school for their 5 hours is a huge responsibility. Anything in any legislation that can give direction to principals is appreciated, but you cannot give direction unless you give support. And if principals are being asked to follow up on things that happen in the community, playing themselves out in the classroom, in the school, so that it interferes with learning, absolutely. But if they're going to be given that responsibility, they have to be given the support that goes with it. I know there was a mention made yesterday at the briefing about school boards will now be able to work with other agencies. Mr. Speaker, school boards have been working with agencies, all kinds of agencies, for a long, long time. I'm not sure what the intent of that statement was, but it certainly sounded to me like it's doing exactly what is happening now. And what we have recognized is, Mr. Speaker, that we have to do things differently than we are doing them now. We have technology that we did not even have 2 years ago. And every young person that you see walking down the street from ages 5 to 25 has some sort of technology in their hand. It is their way of communicating. It is a part of their life. And it's well beyond the understanding of many of their parents. So if teachers are trying to deal with something in 5 hours, let's not forget that there's another huge part of their day and their night where the supervision is not from a teacher, it's not from a principal, but it's from the community and it's from their parents. And together, Mr. Speaker, those people who care about kids, and that's parents and community and teachers, can come together and try to understand and try to change the culture. The minister has talked about culture. I couldn't agree with her more. The culture that exists there now is something that we did not experience, that we did not know, and that some do not understand. So changing that culture alongside, and that's the long term, and I know in the task force report, as I said earlier, some of those recommendations were long term because they did speak about changing the culture, and some of them are short term. What I want to see happen, and what I believe every MLA in this House wants to see happen, is that the language in this particular bill translates into action that will help those kids in our communities who are looking for help or who don't know that they need help or who are afraid to come forward and say they do. If this does not translate into action, Mr. Speaker, then we have not gained anything from the tragedies that we've had in this province. We know that there's a fair number of recommendations or articles in this particular bill, clauses in this bill, that speak to the justice and the implementation of this bill. And there will be an investigative team that is hired and tasked with going out and providing that support, doing that investigation. We know that it brings an opportunity for people through civil court to bring those who they believe are bullying and cyberbullying to court. We know that getting a court order in this province is not easy. And I would hope that there will be, that this process will be facilitated so that if somebody does stand up and if somebody does report and if somebody does want a court order, that they don't have to wait years and years and years for that court order. Because during that wait time, we've seen what's happening, and we cannot afford, Mr. Speaker, to wait. We have, as we said, many recommendations in that task force report. It pulled in a lot of Nova Scotians who wanted to make a difference. Some of them, Mr. Speaker, are waiting for that to happen. They get encouraged and then they get discouraged. Because they want a change. So they're looking at this bill, they're looking at the minister who now has the lead on this, and they are having some hope that this will translate into some action. Members of this Liberal caucus have spoken out about the need. We've spoken out about the opportunities that have been missed. We support the minister. We support Bill 61. We want it to translate into action, and we'll be watching, Mr. Speaker, because none of us can afford to lose any more time. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this has been a very sad time in our province, in Nova Scotia, in the last few weeks in particular, as all Nova Scotians have followed the tragic circumstances around Rehtaeh Parsons' death. It's a sad time in all communities of the province. It's a reminder, Mr. Speaker, that when one family suffers as tragically as the Parsons family has suffered, that in Nova Scotians, all of us in the Nova Scotia family suffer as well. It is one of the great sadnesses of the province that these things happen, but it is also one of our strengths that we draw on in tough times, that we do feel that same sense of family when any one Nova Scotia family goes through such a big tragedy. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that that same effect happens community after community, time after time. Last year, in my own constituency of Cumberland South, in the town of Parsbro, the Brown family suffered the same tragedy as too many families have been suffering when their 17-year-old daughter, Courtney Brown, having been bullied both on the school grounds and town property and then in her own home through cyberbullying, came to the same sad conclusion as Rehtaeh and too many others when young people, bullied as they are, harassed as they are, assaulted as they are sexually and physically, finally come to that awful point where they feel there's nowhere else to turn. And then we see what happens. So, Mr. Speaker, the most important first thing we should all say over and over and over to young people, there's always one more place to turn. There's always somewhere to go for help. There are your parents. There is your teacher and your principal. There are important mental health services and important sexual health services and important counseling services that are always there. And if we resolve nothing else beyond this bill, let's resolve in this House that we'll always make sure that the resources are available so that not another young woman, not another young Nova Scotian, boy or girl, can come to the point where they feel there's no place else to turn. There's always another place to turn, and we will make sure that there's always another place to turn for them. And so, Mr. Speaker, that is one of the lessons of the tragedy of Rehtaeh Parsons. It's one of the lessons of the tragedy of Courtney Brown. One, a young woman in the Halifax-Dartmouth area. Another, a young woman in a rural part of our province. That no matter where you live, city or country, urban or rural, no matter what your circumstances, you have to know there's always somewhere else to turn. There's always going to be a program for you, or a person, an adult, a counselor, to be there for you. Let's make that determination right now, Mr. Speaker, and we can take another step forward on this journey that we're all on together here in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I shared with the House before that in the wake of the tragic events of the last few weeks, that in my own house, where I have two teenage daughters, we had the conversation, the difficult one, around our own dinner table over several nights about cyberbullying, about identifying it, about protecting yourself, about turning to your mom or dad or your teacher or wherever you need to turn, about where to call, about the hotlines that are available so that they know for themselves and also for their friends. And we've seen some pretty brave stories over the last little while of young people in our schools who weren't on the receiving end of bullying or cyberbullying, but they knew someone that was, because they saw it on the school ground or they saw it on Facebook, and they stepped up in defense of their fellow student. This is one of those examples, Mr. Speaker, that in the face of tragedy, we see an evil, that we see human goodness also step forward, as is happening in our schools. And I want to applaud the students, the young people of Nova Scotia who are now stepping up, not just on their own behalf, but on behalf of their friends and their fellow students. There was a case just yesterday at Halifax West High School of two young students who went to the principal when they saw on Facebook that a fellow student was being cyberbullied. And now that they're aware, or more aware, of the services that are available and where people can turn to get help, they stepped up on behalf of their fellow student. That is goodness in the face of evil. And it's right. And young Nova Scotians are stepping up, and we should applaud them for that. So we've had that conversation at our dinner table in our house, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that many members here with their own kids or grandkids have done the same. And I actually believe that that conversation is happening at the kitchen tables and the dining room tables of thousands and thousands of households around Nova Scotia, as it should, so that kids know that their parents are there as a start, Mr. Speaker, or their guardians are there, or their aunts and uncles are there, their families are there. After all, Mr. Speaker, the number one duty of a parent is to protect their children. And so too, Mr. Speaker, the number one duty of a government is also to provide protection to the citizens of the province, starting with our youngest and most vulnerable. And that's why I rise today to speak to this bill, Bill 61, because it is time for the provincial laws around bullying and cyberbullying to be brought into the 21st century, to be modernized, so that we can take strong action that sends a message to bullies and cyberbullies and provides more information to victims about where to turn. Mr. Speaker, this is not the first time that these ideas about how to modernize our laws have come before this House. Members of both opposition parties have been bringing forward their own bills and their own plans on bullying and cyberbullying for well over a year. I will say I'm pleased that the government has come around and has now brought forward a strong bill that takes up some of those ideas. And because, obviously, there is a majority on the government side, we now have a chance in this House to do the right thing, and that is to enact strong laws and get them on the books as soon as possible. And we'll certainly do our bit to make that happen, Mr. Speaker, because that's what we should do. In this case, that's what Nova Scotians expect us to do. So the bill's provisions, Mr. Speaker, like defining cyberbullying in law, making it an offense or making it a tort, as the government proposes, spelling out that people who are guilty of cyberbullying will be sued, that they'll face awards of damages, substantial financial penalties if guilty. We've been asking for that for over a year. And now, finally, we see that that's going to move forward. Mr. Speaker, when the guilty party is a young person, as it often is in these cases, parents may well find themselves liable for the damages inflicted by a cyberbully. That's also something that we've been calling for over a year. And of course, I'm glad to see that that's now going forward, because it truly does take a whole family to protect victims of cyberbullying, not just the victim's family, but there is a duty on behalf of the family of the bully as well. And so, Mr. Speaker, we're finally going to reflect that in law, and that's a good thing. For those that are found to be cyberbullying, Mr. Speaker, or where a law enforcement official has reasonable grounds to believe they're cyberbullying, the bill proposes that that their identity become known from their internet service provider, and they be visited by a law enforcement official. The minister describes this as an attempt to take away the keyboard courage of a cyberbully. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a good step. But sometimes, Mr. Speaker, you actually have to take away the keyboard. You actually have to confiscate the laptop or the smart cell phone or whatever device is being used as a weapon against young people online. Now, the bill does contemplate that. And I'm glad, because again, that's something we've been asking for the last year, to give our law enforcement officials the power to confiscate electronic devices when they're used as weapons against our young people. And so I'm glad that that's going to come into effect, Mr. Speaker, and encourage that along as fast as possible. And Mr. Speaker, for a year we've been asking the government to give our law enforcement officials, our principals, our teachers, our mental health workers and others the tools to intervene early when they know of cases of cyberbullying or bullying, or they see it or they reasonably suspect it. And now we're going to go in that direction, Mr. Speaker, and so I'm glad that's happening. Because just like it takes a family to protect the victims and to stop the bullies, it really does take a whole community to keep our kids safe. Whether you're a police officer or a teacher or a principal or an adult in our community, Mr. Speaker, it's important that people recognize their own responsibilities to keep our kids safe and keep our community safe, both on the streets, on the school grounds, and online. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that we're getting somewhere, that real action is now coming, but there's more to do, Mr. Speaker, and I do just want to point out there is more to do, that no one should declare victory at this point. Not us in opposition who have been pushing for it for a year, nor should the government declare victory because we now have this bill. It is not about them or us. All this should be about is our young people and keeping it safe. And only when they are safe should we all declare victory that we have taken a positive action that made our province safer online and on the streets for our young people. All of this is about them and them alone, Mr. Speaker. So they need a comprehensive plan. Nova Scotians know that our province made the news both nationally and internationally for very sad reasons over the past few weeks. So let's resolve now that the next time that our province makes the news nationally or beyond, that it's because we've truly become a leader in the protection of our young people in the 21st century. And that work is not done with this bill, Mr. Speaker. That work is not done. I'll give you an example. The Wayne McKay Task Force, the Anti-Bullying Task Force, which spent a year consulting with all the experts and young people and all those involved in protecting them on how we can bring our laws on bullying and cyberbullying into the 21st century. That task force does map out a comprehensive plan. And many of its elements are incorporated into this bill and on the government's action plan. But not all, Mr. Speaker. Not all. And there's more to do. For example, Mr. Speaker, the McKay Task Force calls for bringing the number of guidance counselors in our schools up to an appropriate level relative to the number of students. That there are standards around how many guidance counselors we should have per student, and we are short of that. So in addition to this bill, I want the government to actually provide the funding to our schools to have enough guidance counselors to meet that standard. Another way of telling our young people, you always have somewhere to turn when you're on the receiving end of a bully or a cyber bully. More than that, Mr. Speaker, although this bill does provide our school principals with the tools they need to act, it says that they may take action when they see or know of potential bullying or cyberbullying. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a step forward, but it's not enough. In Section 26 of the bill, it says principals may take action when they see it. But the McKay Task Force, recommendation number 33, compels officials like our principals, when they know of a case of cyberbullying or bullying, to take action. And that is a responsibility that all adults should have. And I believe the bill should have said, you know this is going on in your school. You have reason to believe that you must act. That's what the McKay Task Force reported. That's not what the bill says. If that is somewhere else, I would really like to see that, because that, to me, is an important change. Mr. Speaker, the McKay Task Force, in recommendation number 31, talks about expanding the jurisdiction of principals beyond the school ground. And that is an important step forward. And I acknowledge that it's there. But we also have to make clear that it also extends beyond school hours. That is what the McKay Task Force reported. And the bill has not gone all that way. That duty to act is not restricted to school hours alone. Because in the 21st century, in the modern world, bullying doesn't stop when the school bell rings at the end of the day. We all know when we were growing up, you could get away from it by getting off the school grounds and getting home, and you'd be safe. You are not safe today at 3:10 or whatever time your school closes when the bell rings. You're not, because of the online world, which is an important part of young people's lives. So why not extend that duty to include after school hours, Mr. Speaker, as Dr. McKay recommended? Mr. Speaker, the bill does create a tort in law around cyberbullying and spells out liability that the cyberbully or his or her parents are incurring, and that's good. And so we should. But matched with that, Mr. Speaker, we should make sure that parents and students have all the tools they need to understand the responsibility that we're now imposing on them, rightly imposing on them, when they are online. That if they act illegally online, as the bill will create an illegality, and they are liable for those actions, we need to also make sure that they have the information and the tools to know how to act responsibly online. And Mr. Speaker, that brings up the whole modern concept of the digital citizen and how we have this wonderful new tool, not so new anymore, but wonderful tool of mass modern communication on the internet, social media like Facebook, and so on. And we are learning its power, both its great power to send information around to all people, but we're also learning of its great danger and its great evil. And I do want to speak a little bit about that in a moment, but I understand there's an introduction, and I'm happy to yield.
Thank you, Mr. Member. I would like to call on the Honourable Minister of Finance on a short introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will make it very short. Mr. Speaker, we have a lot of very important guests here today who will be introduced in a moment, but I would like to introduce one member of the visiting party who is a young man who lives in my constituency, and his dad is well known to members of the government side for sure. I would ask Dash Heb if he would stand and receive the warm welcome of the House.
I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Halifax-Shabukto on a longer introduction.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. The young man, Dashel Heb, is part of a larger group who come to us from St. Catherine's School. They're a grade 3 group. There are 34 of the students. St. Catherine's School is a French immersion school located in my constituency. The group is accompanied today by their teacher, Jackie O'Leary, who in fact is a former page from the House, and with various parents. There are with them Rob Zink, Carolyn Lowe, Brian McIntyre, Lisa Jacobs, Christy Winhouse, Gail DeAdder, Gina Jones, Fiona Martin, all attending upon a group of 34 students whose first names I will call. We have present with us Noah, Bridget, Ella, Dashiell, whom we have already heard of, Andrea, Sophia, Surya, Frida, Rachel, Carmen, Andrew, Chase, Eli, Lori, Wheelio, Sasha, Keeley, Spencer, Ethan, Serena, Tamara, Talia, Willem, Branwyn, Katie, Madison, Claire, Rebecca, Amy, James, Robbie, Phoenix, Jordy, and Caleb. And I welcome them all to the House, and I would invite members to show them their welcome.
We welcome all our guests to the gallery this morning and hope they enjoy this morning's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too want to extend our welcome to the visitors in the gallery. Perhaps there's an aspiring politician or two up there in that class, and maybe someday they'll be down here. Mr. Speaker, I was just speaking about the need to ensure that with this modern tool of social media, with all the good it can do in getting information around to people, and all the power it has that can also be hurtful, extremely hurtful, that we include in our school curriculum, that we include for all Nova Scotians, information, teachings about what it means to be a citizen in the 21st century, including the rights, responsibilities, duties, and liabilities that we incur when we exercise our citizenship online. And I hope that we get to that point, Mr. Speaker, quickly, because the McKay Task Force actually did recommendation number 64 and again in number 65, that it's time, given all that's happened, to include in the school curriculum the ability to teach digital citizenship so that Nova Scotia can truly be a leader in bringing our province, our citizens, young and old, into the 21st century. Because, Mr. Speaker, it is the duty of all citizens to use the resources that our great province has provided to them, to use the resources that through their own work, through their own efforts, they have amassed for themselves for good, in safety, for the benefit of their families and their communities, and not to do harm. And now we know, Mr. Speaker, that there is a whole new way that harm can be done, tragic harm, through social media online. And Mr. Speaker, just to drive that point home, all of us in this House, at some point or another, were newly elected members. And I am sure, I speak from my own experience, but I'm sure it's true of all of us, that as a newly elected member, remember that first time that we read a newspaper report online or some commentary online, and then look to see all the anonymous comments attached to it, particularly if it's a story that we ourselves are a part of, as happens to members in this House from time to time. And how stung we felt the first time we read an anonymous posting about one of us. How stung we felt that someone that we don't even know, or we don't even know if we know them or not, is saying hurtful, nasty things about us as people. That certainly has happened to all of us, I'm sure. And we are, in politics, you know, expected to be ready to understand that and to accept it and to move on, Mr. Speaker. But it's still hard when it happens. It's still hard when it happens. And I believe that there are people who never get over it, who obsess on it as adults. You know, as a 40-something or 50-something or 60-something-year-old person with all the life experiences that we already had before we came to this place. How hurtful it is. Now, Mr. Speaker, imagine that exact same situation, except you're a 15-year-old girl or a 14-year-old boy, and this is happening to you. Someone who doesn't have the benefit of all of those years of growing up to know how to deal with that, and how hurtful it is, how sadly hurtful it is, whether it's anonymous or from a classmate. Madam Speaker, we cannot leave our young people in that vulnerable position. We've seen where that can lead. We know that feeling of there's nowhere else to turn. And for that reason, Madam Speaker, it is so important that we turn this situation around and fast. And I said a moment ago, Madam Speaker, that Nova Scotia made news for all the wrong reasons, nationally and internationally, in the last few weeks. As around the world, people watched the Rehtaeh Parsons story unfold. Well, let's just resolve that someday soon, because of the work of all parties, because of our resolve here to modernize our own laws, to protect our young people, that someday with this bill and others, other steps that still need to be done, that Nova Scotia will again make the news, because we are a leader in protecting our young people. We're not there yet. This bill is a step along the way. We're not there yet, but that is really what we all need to do if we're going to accomplish something positive here in this session in the future. So with those few words, Madam Speaker, I will take my place. Thank you.
Now recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And I think it's very important to get up and say a few words on Bill 61, which is known as the Cyber Safety Act. And I think for the public that watch this at home, it's important to kind of outline a little bit about what's in the Act. The Act is pretty extensive. It's quite a long piece of legislation, 20 pages of clauses and various penalties and outlining some action that will be taken to try and combat cyberbullying in our province. And I would hope to set a standard for other provinces to follow. I think that is important that we have finally begun to put some teeth into the legislation that's been brought here. As the member from Colchester North, thank you, had mentioned, there have been 2 pieces of legislation brought here in the last couple of years in relation to other cases of cyberbullying and other issues that had certainly garnered provincial attention, if not national and international attention. But I think the travesty here today is that it has taken such a lot of profound public input and a petition that the last time I looked was at about 300,000. It's probably many more names on that petition now, the one that asked and called for action on behalf of Rehtaeh Parsons. It takes that kind of public outcry, not only among Nova Scotians, but much broader area, to actually get us back to what's important here and to put some teeth into the legislation that the government has had an opportunity to do. I wanted to mention in context, Madam Speaker, we are here in the legislature often highly partisan, and I know it's been mentioned, the member from Fairview mentioned it the other day, that we've become even more partisan in the last number of months and perhaps years. But the fact is, it's pretty ridiculous to suggest that the Liberals in the 1990s should have done something about this, or even in the Conservative time 4 years ago, that we would have done something about this. Texting has become very, very widely used now. And I think 4 years ago, I wasn't sending any texts. I don't believe children and others were sending texts. Very new. Facebook is 2005. I think maybe the most highly advanced members of the legislature were doing it because they lived in the States at the time. They were more adept. But literally, this is very new to parents. I know a lot of parents don't text at all themselves, and a lot of them aren't using half of the facilities that their phones offer. They're not aware of what their children are doing, what the capacity is to do. I just think, to put it in context, this is a problem that has exploded in the last 3, 4, 5 years. It really has. And the extent of it and the negativity, the nastiness of what can be said online has just exploded. And we know how quickly the internet has changed even in the last few years. Tools that were being widely used a few years ago, like MSN and so on, they're passé. There's other ways to communicate. There's Twitter. There's instantaneous communication. I just want to make that point, that it's been vastly changing, quickly changing, very difficult for parents and obviously for lawmakers to keep up. People in positions of authority have not been keeping up, and we in the legislature have not kept pace. And Madam Speaker, when I saw this coming today for discussion, and I'm very aware of, as are all members, the context in which we've felt the concern of the public. Many of the members here in the House were at the vigil that was held for Rehtaeh Parsons at Victoria Park on Spring Garden Road. I know there was another one held in Cole Harbour as well. I was reminded, Madam Speaker, of only a few months ago when I attended the vigil in the Grand Parade, which was for the young girl who lost her life in British Columbia, Amanda Todd. And I participated and said a few words at that gathering. Wayne McKay was at that gathering. And again, it's such a similar circumstance, not exactly the same, but similar, where a young girl feels tormented to the point where she just felt she couldn't go on. And we said at that time, this is what bothers me so much, Madam Speaker, is the speakers were saying at that time, we have to take action. We can't let this happen to another girl. And not only do we know of those, and there are other cases, a few other cases we could name right off the top of our heads, but we know there's many, countless others that they've happened. Perhaps their lives have been lost. Perhaps they're suffering in silence. Their families are reeling from the effects of what is not just bullying. I have to say, it is criminal acts, serious criminal acts that even under our laws today, even without the passage of this bill, should be acted upon, should be treated as criminal acts. Sexual assault, or if you want to call it what it is, it's rape. Rape is against the law. And if a person's been raped and a young person, a minor has been raped, and if those photographs are shared, that's child pornography, if you ask me. And there are laws against child pornography. So I think a lot of us are reeling with the idea that, that we can't understand why those laws that we trust and that are in place haven't been acted on and aren't being acted on, not just in one case, but I think in many cases. We live in a province where sexual assault is underreported. We know that, and yet at the same time, we have the highest rate of sexual assault in the country, even though we know it's underreported, that a lot of women will not come forward and don't want to go through the agony, really, of the court system and trying to get anything done, any justice accomplished. And at the same time, so I've said, we're underreported, we still have the highest rates of reported sexual assault, and we have the lowest conviction rates. Add that together. If you were a woman who was sexually assaulted and you're already suffering emotionally and physically and mentally, would you want to put yourself into a court system that routinely is not finding criminal fault, or the people are getting away with it? And I just don't think the justice system has sent a strong enough signal that we've taken these concerns seriously enough. I really feel that the laws we have been on the record. They should be good for much more than they're being used for. And I think some of that is cultural and attitudinal, and we need to do more about that as well. Cyberbullying and bullying in general is a really big problem, and certainly cyberbullying played a part in this criminal case that we're talking about. But we shouldn't confuse outright, clearly criminal acts with bullying, which the very word bullying might underestimate or somehow downplay the seriousness of what we're talking about, because we're talking about activities that do and can ruin lives. And people feel helpless. That's what struck me from listening to parents. We've heard parents here at Law Amendments. We've heard them on the news more recently saying how helpless you feel, and I can only imagine, again, where you would turn or what you would go, what you would do in that circumstance. It must be extremely, extremely difficult for parents, and they feel that the systems have failed their children, and the social agencies and the supports are not there. So I'm really glad. I do want to begin by saying, again, as the member from Colchester North said, we're really glad to see one minister charged with dealing with this file and this case and doing something meaningful, not just lip service, not just small Band-Aids, as we saw in a couple of the other bills that have come through that didn't fully respond to the 85 recommendations that came here from the report by Wayne McKay. That report, and I know the minister has called it foundational, I believe it was prescriptive. It had 85 recommendations that were as clear as saying, ask your justice minister to go to Ottawa. That's clear. Start the discussion. Get the laws changed. Get on with this. We have to lobby Ottawa. Obviously, some of this is in the criminal code. It's federal laws. But if the provinces don't tell Ottawa that this is needed, then it's not going to be on their agenda. And that was one of the recommendations. Start that discussion now. Well, we could have begun that discussion months ago if that had in fact been seen as a blueprint or an outline for all the things that needed to be done. And instead it was seen as something that could be maybe chipped away at over a long time, or maybe not urgent enough. Again, it was mentioned that twice at Law Amendments we've had parents come and others come asking for changes, and more stronger changes in the two pretty light bills that we had earlier relating to cyberbullying. And the amendments that were put on the table, and I don't really care if they were Conservative amendments or Liberal amendments. They were Liberal amendments, but they were turned down, and they were turned down for partisan reasons at that committee. And members of the public would probably know that because we have a majority government, our committees are also a majority of members from the governing side, from the NDP side of the House, and fewer members from the opposition side of the House. And therefore, any suggestions that are brought by opposition members can be very easily voted down at a committee of 9 members, where we are outnumbered. And I think that there's been a shift away from looking for good ideas and trying to accommodate good ideas, which we did see in a minority government situation. Now, I agree that my first 6 years in the legislature was a minority situation. It wasn't a majority, so that the Conservatives during their years, from 2003 at least to 2009, were willing to consider and accommodate some opposition requests. There were certainly NDP requests that were accepted during that time. There was more dialogue on bills that came through. As an opposition member, I was able to to make suggestions on a number of bills where I was very, I felt that I could be part of the process. I felt that as an opposition member, we were being listened to. At least there was a little bit of consideration. Yeah. Madam Speaker, you were also a member of opposition during that time, and I know other members that were elected at the same time as I was, including the minister who's now responsible for this file, will know what I'm saying is true. And that with a majority government, you can wield utter control. You can tell the opposition to, the government can tell the opposition to pound sand, and therefore, no wonder we get a little bit frustrated and we say, we put good ideas in front of the Law Amendments Committee. We tried to make positive and constructive change. Our amendments are not done to obstruct government. They're not brought forward to somehow make life difficult for government. They're brought forward because we're also listening to people that we represent. And we know that people come to us with good ideas. And we're trying to also be an avenue to bring those ideas to the floor of the legislature to be accepted into our legislation as we go forward. And that's what the Law Amendments Committee is for. And I think it's wonderful that Nova Scotia has a Law Amendments Committee. I understand, I think we're the only province that has it. Maybe the clerk will let me know, but I think we're certainly one of the very few that has a law amendments process where people have an opportunity to say something about legislation, and that is members of the public as well, have an opportunity to say something about legislation as it's moving through the legislature and being considered. And we need to listen to the public, because as an MLA, I can tell all members of the House the best ideas I've had, I think, have come from members of the public when they've had an issue themselves and they've faced some problem, and they've come to me and said, why don't we just have a law that does this, or why don't we amend that rule so that it would address this circumstance? And very often, because they face that issue, they have an insight and a wisdom about it that I may never have even looked at that particular issue had it not been for their advice. And therefore, I would suggest that the members of the government would have been well served 15 months ago had they listened, had the members that were sitting around that table said, let's have a break and discuss this with our caucus. These amendments make sense. Let's put them in play. It's not just the opposition asking, it's sometimes parents. There definitely was a parent from Truro who spoke to Law Amendments Committee who had already suffered the same loss that we're here today responding to, the same loss of a child, the same, basically the same circumstance. And we need to be sensitive and open-minded. And that's what I'm disappointed and I'm sure other members feel the same way. I'm sure the minister feels the same way. How dreadful it is that it takes such a tragedy, and a tragedy that we could not, we couldn't overlook, we couldn't turn away from. It's so big, and the attention on it is so strong. And we've said it before. Again, I say when we spoke at Amanda Todd's, could you take that away? Thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry. When we spoke at the vigil for Amanda Todd, we said this should never happen again. It's making noise. So, thank you. I have an electronic device here that's making noise, so it's going away because I don't know how to deal with that at this moment. Thank you. Madam Speaker, there were a number of good recommendations in the McKay report. We know 85 recommendations, and quite a few of the ones with teeth are now in this bill. And thank you very much. I wanted to just, make the point about some of the points that are in here now. The ability, obviously, to go to Ottawa and to start the discussion with other justice ministers around the country and with the federal justice minister. That's now been kick-started, and literally kick-started. You know, and it's unfortunate that it has to be in this circumstance, because now it does look like damage control rather than the kind of positive thing we could have done when it wasn't in the face of a disaster. 15 months ago, we could have said we'd taken steps, and if something like this had happened, all of us could have said the bills were good, that we brought in good legislation, and now it would be a question of how do we enforce it. Madam Speaker, again, I go back to some of the criminal laws that we have today, and I wonder why they're not properly enforced, and why women and children and youth are not protected from so many of these attacks that they're suffering. Now, I understand the technology is new, and that's what I said. We haven't had this kind of technology. It certainly didn't exist in the 90s. And you know, I don't think it does any good to lay blame to earlier governments in this case. We have to respond. Well, now that we know the enormity of the problem, and now we know how pervasive technology is, and it will always be now in the lives of young people, we have to now set those parameters, set rules, set penalties, and this does do that now. I understand that the Minister of Justice has announced an investigative team that's going to go into place in the next 4 to 6 months, and that investigative unit will work around the province and respond to any complaints that come in on cyberbullying. It says in the most extreme cases, they will have the power to take away an electronic device from somebody who is abusing it and using it for harm to others. I think it's very good to know that the power will be there for people to sue another person who cyberbullies them, who uses electronic means to harm them, and that if that person happens to be underage and they're sued, their parents will be held responsible. And I think that's important too, because I know how difficult it is to make people responsible, but they are responsible for their children and the activities of their children. We have other laws in different cases that do that. But I think it's important that parents know that they are going to be held accountable as well. And so we need to make that loud and clear and make sure that people know that this is required. Again, the recommendation, I think it was 42, that would give internet providers the power to basically pull the plug on somebody who's abusing their internet service, using it for hate and using it for criminal activities like cyberbullying and harming others, that if that inappropriate and illegal activity is going on, they can pull the plug and take away that account. That could have been done when Dr. McKay's report was tabled here more than a year ago, but you know, we're glad to see that it's going to be in place now. And again, I think that the recommendations that had real teeth have now finally found their way into a piece of legislation here. I don't know why the government monkeyed around with it in previous 2 bills that were really soft pedaling, no more than lip service to the problem that was before us. And I think that is a travesty. I think that the government most likely regrets it today, that there wasn't more action on the part of the ministers who had control at the time. And now, one positive move right now is that we have one minister who can take responsibility and move this file forward on behalf of several ministries, because there's too much I guess, division in terms of who has control, if it's justice and education and people being territorial about their individual levels or spans of control. I don't know if the ministers were being territorial and not wanting to share that file with each other, but so many of the issues we deal with cross over. It's health and justice and education together. You know, these things are common, that they're going to cross boundaries. We have the status of women, which is affecting a number of different departments. This is definitely a women's issue today, although there are boys that are bullied as well. But I think, like so many things, you might, you know, I don't have the figures, but I know that individually the case that has propelled us here has been an issue of a girl. But I think the cases that we've mentioned where it has ended in tragedy, they've all been girls that we know of and that have been in the press here in Nova Scotia. But we need to protect all our young people, Madam Speaker, because they're definitely, we know there are cases around homophobia, around anybody who's different, you know, in around people perhaps who are new to our country, whose languages aren't as good. There's just a lot of meanness in the world. And often when you're in high school or even younger, anybody who's a little bit different gets targeted, or anybody who's a little bit vulnerable or you know, has made any mistakes at all, they get targeted. And Madam Speaker, I spoke earlier about drinking under health estimates and the worry around our drinking culture. There is an element of that as well, a health element in this. I know the minister was at the high school in my riding last evening or yesterday in Halifax West, and it's a school of 1,500 students. I know that, like every other school in this province, drinking is an issue there. So are drugs, but drinking is an issue, and I think we need to again have better education to protect young people from the physical, mental, and vulnerability issues that come around drinking. And oftentimes it's somebody young who isn't aware of that, you know, and hasn't anyone to look after them in that case. And I think that many of us may have been there ourselves in our youth. And, you know, I say that there's a lot of things that I often think there, but for the grace of God go I. There's so many times when you think that, you know, that could have happened to me or to my own children or to somebody I love. So I think we need to be really conscious about that. So I mentioned the drinking because I think that there's a health issue here, and I'm talking about how this transcends one department. And I see the minister is acknowledging that, and that's good because, again, that may be an element of what you have to weave into the answers that we're looking for. And I know it's not in this bill alone because this is about technology and this is about how it's being abused. But the member from Cumberland South did say there are a lot of good kids out there, and I know in the media reports yesterday from Halifax West, there were some wonderful young people who were interviewed and spoke, and they have just a fantastic school spirit. And I think there's over 100 students involved in student government at Halifax West. They have a volunteerism committee, a community involvement committee, a world involvement committee. They're raising money for Gambia. They're doing food drives and clothing drives for Halifax, and they just did a big Head for the Cure event where they raised $17,000 to help the Terry Fox Foundation. And they've been doing that for 10 years. I think over 10 years they've raised about $70,000 at that school. And when I went to the rally for that, you could just see all of the young people that were so involved. So we mustn't forget that there's some great things going on, and that a lot of the young people are really socially aware and concerned about each other. But we need to raise that level for all of them as much as we can, and we really do need not only the education and the soft side of it, the appealing to them and teaching them. We need some enforcement tools, because if we know it's happening and happening in a prevalent way, we have to have the enforcement tools and somebody who can investigate it and treat it seriously. And it's not unlike what the prosecution service did some years ago in getting some prosecutors who were specialists in sexual assault. We didn't have that, and we wanted some that would know exactly the rules and the precedents and the ability that the Crown had to act on sexual assault. And I know we had in our prosecution service here at least one, I think more than one though, specialist to deal with those cases. And I think we need to get that level of expertise among our law enforcement officers, through this investigative team, and further right through to the courts, to the prosecution service and the courts, because there's too much of a boys will be boys attitude around a lot of the bullying and cyberbullying. We heard it, I've heard it on a number of the interviews where young people have been interviewed the last couple of days on CBC, saying that when they went to their schools, they were told to sort of like, oh, well, that's life. Boys will be boys. Just take it and strap. The woman I'm speaking about was from New Brunswick. It was a Fredericton High School incident, and she'll be a speaker apparently here in May at a conference in Halifax. And she's now in university. But she said that was the attitude just a few short years ago. Told boys will be boys, just live with it. And she had to go back to school and sit in the same classroom with boys who were sexually harassing her and bullying her and putting things out online and so on. So, that can't be accepted. And when we see this happening, we have to be, here in this legislature, we have to be strong and stand up and make rules that are going to protect people. And as I said, Madam Speaker, my intent is to try not to be blaming but I do think that we know that we've had 15 months since the recommendations came in from Dr. McKay. And now that this bill is before us, my appeal would be that let us move quickly on these recommendations. Let's pass this bill. Let's listen to the public and law amendments. Let's see that any good suggestions that come forward are listened to this time, whether it's from the public and through the public, perhaps through the opposition as amendments, and let's listen. I don't know what amendments we may want because I don't know what we'll hear from the public. But if there are good suggestions, I would appeal to the government not to reject them purely because they think the opposition get a win. This is not about us getting a win or the government getting a win. There is no win in this. We're in a situation where the public are concerned. People are hurting. Young people have lost their lives and others are suffering and will never have the same life as a result of some of the activities that they've suffered. And so we need to look at this in what is the true sense of our work here, and that is to make life better for Nova Scotians and to work to make a safe and secure place for our young people to grow up. And now that includes not just our physical surroundings, but the cyber world in which people are also active and living, and social life is now taking place. That may be very unfamiliar to those of us who did grow up 50 years ago, but it is not, it's now the reality. Social life, a lot of it is purely digital. And so we need to protect people in that realm as well. And so I am glad to see these changes before us. I do feel that they are late in the fact that the prescription was there 15 months ago, and that Dr. McKay had been pretty clear about what was needed in many ways with 85 recommendations. But the government certainly has our support in seeing action today, and I think you've given it to one of the most capable ministers on the government side to handle such a sensitive and difficult issue. And I therefore will be looking forward to law amendments and to see this bill be enacted. Thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize the honourable member for Truro Bible Hill.
Oh, thank you, Madam Speaker. And in one way, it gives me pleasure to rise today, as always, to speak in this House, but it does not give me pleasure that it has to be about a bill that, unfortunately, we need in this society today. The Cyber Safety Act, or an act to address and prevent cyberbullying. Madam Speaker, I've been listening this morning to many things that have been said in the House about this very urgent and important initiative. And to tell you the truth, it saddens me that in some ways we're all dancing around the issue, which is basically it is about abuse and about the dangers of people trying to have power over others, which seems to be so prevalent in this society today. And kids learn from adults, Madam Speaker. And I think that until the time comes when children see from our grown-up actions that bullying and abuse in all its many forms is not an acceptable form of communication in our society, nothing's going to change. I think children see it from a very early age on, from the television shows that they watch to the videos that they play where they see people killing and hurting each other, and the movies and television shows that they watch. In fact, by the time a child is about 8 years old, they've already seen 5,000 killings of various sorts. And to me, Madam Speaker, this is not acceptable. This is not something that I would like to see our children taught. And when we are surprised at children's actions in the schoolyard or with each other, I really have to shake my head and say, well, where do you think they learned it? And when you read the newspapers and you see people bullying each other in the newspapers, or you even watch reality TV and see people screaming and yelling at each other and calling each other names, Madam Speaker, this does not send a good message to children. Here in this House, oftentimes, we've been talking lately about the toxic atmosphere. It's true. It is toxic, Madam Speaker. And I think jabbing at each other and using using anecdotes of different people in communities and saying that these people are against whatever our government is doing, when in fact we're trying to do something to change, to make a change in society here, Madam Speaker, is not helpful. I understand that critics have a role to play, but I do believe that we all have to work together on these very, very important issues in order to change the behavior that the bill is actually talking to. So, for instance, earlier today, when the member for Colchester North was discussing some of the issues in Truro Bible Hill, for instance, with our cyber KISS, it's called now, the Cyber Internet Safety Group. The fact is, Madam Speaker, we've been working on that project for 4 years now. I've personally been working on it in the community. The whole community has put a lot of effort into this group and into this project. The Nova Scotia Community College students, the digital animation students, worked hours, weeks, months on this project for free, Madam Speaker. Jonathan Torrens, a wonderful professional actor from Nova Scotia, myself as well as a professional actor, we waived our professional fees to actually perform in the video, which, as the member from across the way mentioned, has now been seen by 25,000 students across the province. And what we do as actors in that video is actually speak directly to the students, teaching them about the dangers of bullying online and teaching them internet safety issues. Now, Madam Speaker, those kinds of things are invaluable, and we put our time and energy into this because we believe in it, and we believe that it's going to do good with these young students, with these elementary school students. So I was really pleased to be able to contribute my work for this great initiative. They've also received several grants from the Department of Justice, Lighthouse grants, which I was very happy to help them work on their grant application, and was pleased that they were able to receive. They also actually received just yesterday, Madam Speaker, it was announced that our local Truro Credit Union has now actually come up, and the Truro Community Credit Union has just awarded $2,500 to 2 local anti-bullying initiatives, the Kids Helpline and KISS, the Cyber Internet Safety Society. And the Cyber Internet Safety Society has been supported in large part by the town of Truro and now by the Truro Police Board. So this initiative is not over yet, Madam Speaker, and it's nice to see it growing and growing in the amount of people that are aware of it and the children that are aware of it. So I just wanted to bring that information to the House floor today as well. Also, I'm really pleased that our Department of Education and our Department of Justice has really come up shining on this issue at a time when really, Madam Speaker, no other government has even addressed this issue. In fact, I've been told that the last Conservative government, the Minister of Education, who is actually now the member for Colchester North in the Liberal Party, was actually approached by one of our NDP members, the member for Halifax Atlantic, and she was approached about the problem of bullying, but nothing was done about it, Madam Speaker. So I don't really understand why she's now speaking today and scornfully addressing us on this House over here and the Minister of Education here for actually doing something. To me, that doesn't really make sense, Madam Speaker, so perhaps that's something she might want to talk about next time. Also, there is no federal component for education, Madam Speaker, because, of course, education is covered by the provinces. So when somebody says, well, what have you done with the federal government, that actually is covered by the Department of Justice, Madam Speaker. And in fact, our Minister of Justice just came back from Ottawa, where he had meetings about this very, very issue. Also, we've also heard that the Minister of Education has had many meetings with the various ministers from around the country about this issue, and she is in fact the chair of CMEC, And bullying is very, very much on their agenda, and in fact is one of their #1 priorities, which she spoke with them about as recently as last week. There are many phone calls going back and forth, Madam Speaker, and when they meet in person, that is on the agenda. We've already seen several changes in the Department of Education with schools right across Nova Scotia. Every staff member, every bus driver, everybody, every EA, every teacher, and all the principals now have to report all incidents of bullying, and the department has developed an actual software, Madam Speaker, that is already being used in order to report every incident, so that at the end of the year we'll be able to get a report about the bullying behavior. And all staff members have also been trained now how to report and what to report, so that everybody is on the same page. I think, Madam Speaker, this speaks volumes to what this government is doing. And it's interesting to note that CTV has certainly noticed what we're doing, because in fact last night it was quoted both by Lisa Laflamme and another reporter that Nova Scotia, quote, Nova Scotia walked the walk today. Instead of just talking about change, they've done it. I think that says a lot. So, Madam Speaker, I have one last thing I'd like to mention about this issue before I sit down, and that is that in Truro Bible Hill, we did have a candlelight vigil for Amanda Todd, who is another innocent victim of bullying from